we'll do now is we'll go ahead, we'll put the left half of the receiver back on. But before we do that, I want to talk a little bit about the receiver O-ring. This is what is going to create the seal on your power tube, and that's going to help ensure that your Cyclone feed is going to feed every time. I have seen in some cases where if that O-ring's not present, the Cyclone feed will malfunction. So we'll go ahead, we'll put the left half receiver back on. Sometimes what you'll run into is that the spring, being that it's longer than the channel it sits in, it'll kind of hang off the back end. Most of the time what I'll do is I can take the guide pin and just kind of guide it back into place, and you'll feel the receiver kind of fall down into place. Then from there, just push it back down. Go ahead, go back through and tighten your receiver bolts. You're not going to want to tighten these down too tight, just snug. Just once it stops turning, you're going to want to maybe just add a little bit more pressure, and that's just about it. They should never really be too tight. Just kind of go back through and check to make sure they're snug. Okay. Now we'll go ahead, we'll reinstall our Cyclone feeder bolt. This bolt you also want to make sure is just snug. Okay. Now that we have all that put back together, we're going to go ahead and reinsert our front bolt, our linkage arm, our power tube, and our valve assembly that is inside the power tube. A lot of people will replace the power tubes with aftermarket power tubes and aftermarket parts, and they always want to know how to get the valve out. They always have a hard time trying to get the valve out of the power tube. A real easy way to get your valve out of your power tube is to just simply tap it on a hard surface. Usually I'll use something that I'm not going to damage and just kind of tap it. And then you'll see that the valve assembly will start to slide down the power tube. Then from there you can usually take an Allen key and just kind of gently push it out of the back end. And that's pretty much how you get your valve assembly out of the power tube. You're going to use the same process to put your valve assembly back into the power tube. You don't want to really push on your valve stem, because what that'll do, and you can see that it's done it right here, is it will push the internals of the valve out of the front of the valve. So we'll go ahead and we'll get those internals put back into place. When the internals pop out, you want to make sure that you have your spring, then your washer, then last your O-ring. Your O-ring is actually what seats up against the tombstone, and that's what creates the seal for your valve. So we'll go ahead and put your front bolt back onto the power tube. You want to make sure that this isn't backwards. You always want the O-ring facing toward the front of the gun. We'll go ahead and reinstall the rear bolt. Same thing, you always want the rear bolt O-ring to be facing the power tube and the front end of the gun. So we'll go ahead and reinsert everything into the back end of the X7 marker. And sometimes when you get to this point, you might feel a little friction. Like I was saying before, you don't want to push on the back end of the valve stem because it'll push all your internals out of the front of the valve. So usually what I do when it gets to this point is you can take an Allen key or a screwdriver or something like that, stick it inside the rectangular slot of the power tube. This isn't going to damage anything by doing this. And you can slide the power tube assembly back into place. From there, you're going to want to reinsert your tombstone just to hold that valve assembly in place. Make sure those internals aren't going to pop out when you're reassembling. And then I usually put the mag well on. You always want to make sure that the back end of the mag well is lined up with the receiver. And then we'll go through the trigger assembly. We get a lot of people that take the trigger assembly apart, and when they go to reinstall the trigger assembly or the springs, they'll get the springs flip-flopped. You always want to make sure that the red spring is in front of the trigger. That's your trigger return spring. And the blue spring, that's your sear spring. You never want to get these mixed up. If, for instance, they did get mixed up, your sear would fall down a little bit, and that would damage your rear bolt and your sear. So we're going to go ahead and just put that back. Put your safety in. Your safety just slides right in through the 12 o'clock position. You're going to have this thumb selector at the 12 o'clock position. Then from there, just tip it down. We'll go ahead and reinstall the grip frame onto the X7. We'll put a push pin in there just to hold it for now. Then we'll also put in the rear bolt plug or insert, your drive spring, guide pin, and then once again you want to make sure that the back end of the guide pin is in the center of the end cap. So we'll go ahead and put all that in. You have your push pins that you're going to want to reinsert. You have one that's a little bit longer than the other. The longer pins always go towards the bottom. You know, say for instance in your grip frame or where your tombstone is located or at the bottom of the foregrip. Your shorter pins are going to go into the top of the end cap and the very top of your foregrip. So we'll go ahead, we'll reinstall the barrel. Okay, now we've got that on there. Go ahead and reinstall our magazine. So it snaps into place there. That one fit a little tight. It's not uncommon for your magazine to fit real tight like that. That's just going to ensure that it's not going to fall out during gameplay. We're going to go ahead and reinstall our foregrip. Our foregrip push pins. Like I said, the longer one goes in the bottom, the short one goes into the top. And then last but not least, we have our rear sight. Go ahead and put our rear sight in. And the rear sight screws especially, you want to make sure that they're not too tight. They really just need to be snug a little bit. And then you don't want to over tighten these. You could crack the plastic on the rear sight if you over tighten them. So just snug, and that's sufficient. And then just to go back through and check to make sure that everything's working correctly, I usually just take the gun, cock it back, pull the trigger, make sure that the bolt assembly's free and moving in there when you pull the trigger. You can do that a couple times just to check to make sure that nothing, make sure that everything's working right. And that's the disassembly and reassembly of the X7 marker.